Biogeography is an interesting interdisciplinary subject that brings to one place data and scientists and results and hypotheses from biology, geography, geology, physics, chemistry, you name it. And a lot of people don't cover the history of their sciences, but in biogeography it's kind of important for this reason. So if you're looking at the book, the chapters 1 and 2 are on the origins of the science and a little bit about the history. And then next would be chapters 3 and 4, which are largely review for you, the physical settings, environmental constraints, if you will. So I want to talk about history a little bit first because I want to go into a little bit more detail than the book does. There is a lot of new research being done on the pre-evolutionary, that is pre-Darwin Wallace views of biogeography. And almost all of these deal with the Western Christian ideas of Noah's Ark, that there was a global flood, a man took a selection of animals and plants, saved them on a boat. He traversed huge parts of the planet and then landed somewhere. It brings about the whole idea of the center of origin. And so natural historians at this time would have just predicted that, oh, a boat landed, everything had a center of origin here. Let's say it is Mount Ararat in Turkey, where some people think that this ark has landed or had landed. Center of origin. It's an important concept, and it still works in a scientific sense for a lot of groups, as we're going to see, but this is kind of a pre-evolutionary, pre-scientific view. Well, let's look at some of these. Linnaeus, most of you know him as the father, patriarchal term, sorry, but father of taxonomy, but he also invoked a biogeographic theory that involved the flood. So you had flood occurring and then organisms dispersing in pairs from these mountainous islands. He invoked climate belts as part of a elevational regime. Interesting stuff. Buffon came up with what's now called Buffon's law, that different parts of the globe will have different species even if the climate and environment are the same. So he started being able to recognize that the tropics of Africa have the same general climate as the tropics of South America, but there are different species. So you have these vast inhospitable areas in between. The case of Africa and South America, the vast inhospitable area would be the Atlantic Ocean. And during this somehow migration or cross, these species would improve or degenerate, evolve. So it's a little statement on evolution or change before we've codified it with natural selection. Buffon was a polymath, a well-read and well-respected person, and there's a nice little quote by him there. The earth makes the plants, the earth and the plants make the animals. So that lays out what most of you know as Ecology 101. Ecosystems are structured first by the plants. Once you have the plants, you get the organisms that eat them and successive other levels of the food pyramids. Captain Cook, not really a scientist, but the very rough captain of the boat, the Endeavour, that traveled around the globe in the late 1700s and was important because he brought along several scientists with him, not for pure scientific reasons, but to somehow find ways to market products or collect things that could be made into moneymakers for the British Empire. In particular, he brought along this fellow Joseph Banks, who collected, like it says there, over 1,000 new species. And one of the things he realized is that, wow, I can barely fit these many species on this boat, it's no longer plausible to think that there would have been a boat, like an ark, that could fit all the animals, all the plants, when I can't even do it with this small sample. We'll get back to Banks. Forster was also on the Endeavour, and Forster was one of the persons that gives us an early glimpse of a latitudinal diversity gradient. One of the things he noticed was that plants have more species in the tropics and less towards the poles. He also gives us an early glimpse of what's another important thing in biogeography, the species area effect, meaning small little islands that have less geographic area have less species than larger islands, which have less species still than mainlands. So the more the area, the more the species. Interesting little sidelight. Didn't publish a lot, though. Carl Wildenau. He was an early synthesizer of plant biogeography. And again, one of the things he did was accumulate data and read others' data. And he started saying, well, we can't really just have one place where all of life originated. There had to be multiple centers of origin, and that as the floods recede, these plants would disperse down slope. Now notice he still had to incorporate a Noah's Ark hypothesis in his ideas, but the whole notion of one single place was starting to break down. We get to Humboldt, who is a heroic figure in so many sciences. There are more named things, meaning mountains, ocean currents, rivers, counties, cities, craters on the moon, species of animals and plants named for Humboldt than anyone else. He was a brilliant observer and world traveler, and one of the things that he's now considered responsible for is the codification of this latitudinal diversity gradient. He also noticed it up and down mountainsides in South America. So the latitudinal gradient has an analog in the elevation gradient. And of course, he mapped these. Beautiful quote from him. This is just lovely writing, lovely reading. We'll talk more about Humboldt throughout the class. Candolle, he made the distinction between factors operating on a small scale versus factors operating on a big scale. So he called these stations and habitations. Stations, if you look at what that is there, that's basically ecology. It's what a lot of ecologists do, sort of pick a small area and study intensely their group of organisms they're interested in, and then various environmental physical factors. Habitations were separations into larger groups around the globe. Today we might call these provinces or realms. And he noticed things sort of like, well, Australia has lots of mammals, but those mammals are kangaroos, wallabies, koala bears. They're marsupials. You know, there are other places around the globe that have similar climate, similar ecological stations, but they have different organisms there. So separation of stations versus habitations. Charles Lyell, famous in a geological context for a whole bunch of things, but he started realizing that the literature that was growing of zoological provinces, sort of looking at these large-scale groupings around the globe, also works with fossils. And if it works with fossils, it's going to help us tell time. Because if you have large regions where, say, let's go again to the marsupials. Marsupials exist over several thousand square miles in Australia and of surrounding islands there. Then fossils of those marsupials will allow you to compare and correlate and establish same-time relationships between rocks in New Zealand, rocks in Tasmania, rocks all over Australia, rocks in different Indonesian islands, correlation. Famous little summation of that is, as in space, so in time. It works for the modern. It's going to work for the past too. Important injection of time into biogeography. But Lyell is also known for the very sad concept of land bridges. Now, land bridges sometimes work, like the photograph or the image you see there, for the migration of humans from Asia into North America during a time of lower sea level, different climates. There was a continuous land bridge, land area called Beringia, that these humans crossed into North America. But Lyell invoked land bridges across the whole Atlantic, across the whole Pacific. If he needed one, he sort of drew one up. Today, that's kind of dismissed. We go to the next person, Leopold von Buch. Very few of you probably studied or know him, but he's important. He was a contemporary of Humboldt, and I know him in the context of geology and paleontology, but he also published a very early manuscript that talked about descent and evolution of organisms mediated by geographic barriers, isolating populations of species. That sounds pretty modern. That sounds like allopatric speciation and ideas and things that Darwin and Wallace would come up with much, much later. The next slide shows a quote from von Buch, which, if you decipher his writing there, essentially says what I just said, an early allopatric speciation theory. Skip up to Phil Sclater, and Phil Sclater was interested in birds, and he published a map of the world that recognized global regions with distinct faunas. And so we still use these terms in several contexts. There is the Palearctic, the Nearctic, the Australiana, etc., etc. Large groupings that have similar faunas within them. We definitely are going to talk more about these larger zoographic groupings throughout the course. Then we get to Alfred Russel Wallace, another heroic figure in biogeography, of course, as well in natural selection. He was the first co-discoverer of natural selection, influenced Darwin to finish his writings on the subject, but he's also important for us here. And so in your book, there's box 2.1 on page 27, which details Wallace's contributions to this science. Yes, I recommend you read it. In particular, he is responsible for the whole idea that you can draw a line on a map, and this line can then delimit different faunas. And so between the islands of Bali and Lombok, he was able to say, well, on one side of this line, the mammal faunas are dominated by marsupials. On the other side of this line, even though these islands are so close you could swim from one to the other, it's going to be dominated by placental mammals. This is responsible for a boundary, a line that could be mapped. He had no idea why that might be so. That comes along later. Alfred Wegener, the climatologist who became a geologist and gave us the whole notion of continental drift. This immediately made the whole idea of land bridges obsolete. You don't need little land bridges popping up everywhere to allow this motion of animals. You have vast parts of the globe. He thought it was just continents. We now know in tectonics, plate tectonics, that it's larger pieces, but that's what's moving. So brilliant man, another sort of key to our biogeographic puzzle. And of course, this is just a series of maps of the globe showing this from today all the way back to 200 million years ago. All the positions of these plates have changed. Summarizing a lot of this, you'd say that biogeography, like many sciences, has gone from descriptive phase, and that's where you're just saying this thing exists here. And you have many, many papers and monographs and books published just documenting the faunas, the floras of different places. Descriptive science usually then leads to narrative science. And narrative science is where you try to come up with some sort of story or explanation to describe that pattern. Why are marsupials dominant in Australia? The narrative phase of science then gives way to what I've got in red here, the analytical phase. And that's where you take data and you test hypotheses, and usually involving some statistical significance. So in ecology, especially terrestrial but also marine, that has done it. It's made the whole transition from descriptive to narrative to analytical. You can't do ecology today without vast, exotic analytical processes at the end of it. Fossils have come into play here as well. So paleontology, paleobiology is entering the analytical realm. And geology. Ever since Wegener confirmed plates or continents move and plate tectonics have come along, that's refined. In biology, systematics, biology, etc., now conservation. So we are in an advanced state in biogeography. Let's go back to Joseph Banks and the whole notion of, it brings us to conservation biogeography. Joseph Banks was both a heroic and a tragic figure. He was that scientist on the Endeavour that collected all those thousands of species, but he didn't just collect them. He initiated a transplanting campaign, which today we would call human-mediated invasion. He took seeds from all different places and planted them in different places just to see if they would grow again, to create more crop space for products that the British Empire could make money off of. So the example I give there, seeds he collected in Brazil, he planted on various Pacific islands with devastating results. So the legacy of Joseph Banks is this homogenization of floras all across the Indo-Pacific region. And then also, he was a primary proponent of saying that Australia, a lot of land, not much going on there, kind of a wasteland. This should be a place where we send our prisoners, the unwanted, the undesirables of England, the people literally taken right out of prison, were put on boats and sent to Australia, out of sight, out of mind. They sent with them food, things they need to eat. So these convicts showed up with cattle, sheep, things that they were, plants that they were, seeds that they were going to plant, other animals, but then also other things, rats, mice, vermin, and all of them made this transition to Australia. And you can pinpoint the day, January 27th, 1788, a red letter day. The first of these fleets of convicts arrived in Sydney Cove, and since that time there's been a biological invasion unmatched anywhere around the globe, and Australian endemism will never recover. We're never going to get back these faunas that, well, most of us never seen or heard of even. That's enough for our introduction to history. Next, you would look at the environmental parameters stuff of chapters 3 and 4. There's going to be a small note set put up. It's not going to be narrated, but you'll have access to it.